Okay, got it. Okay, so we're going to talk about ethnicity, which is a very complex topic, but a very simple topic. So this is my personal DNA ethnicity chart. So I've done my DNA on 3 different sites: Ancestry, 23andMe. My heritage, I did not do the DNA on there, but I transferred it from an Ancestry over. So Ancestry says I'm about 56% what they call England and Northwestern Europe, 14% Ireland, 13% Scotland, 9% Norway, etc. And I get my 1% Indian, which for those of you who have followed my genealogy know, I actually can document that, which is amazing. 23andMe says 98% Northwestern European, which generally follows what's on the Ancestry, but it's a little bit different, but it's basically the same. And then they've identified different areas within Britain and Ireland and France and Germany that they associate me with genetically. My heritage, somewhat the same. They picked up a little Eastern European over here and what they call Iberian. Those are different than what I get over here, although they may cross-relate to Germanic Europe and to French and German. So when you see results like this for DNA, they bring to mind the question of what is it they're actually doing here? So if I look at Ancestry, they will do a little map for me, and the map will say, okay, there's this much that's England and Northwestern Europe, Ireland, Scotland, Germanic Europe, Norwegian, Indigenous American. And we will particularly get into this today, but one of the things Ancestry does is it has the immigration idea. So it finally circles me down in Appalachian America, West Virginia, Kentucky, Southwestern Virginia, which is where my family's from. And they say, boy, a lot of folks who have this went there. So what are they actually doing? So what they're doing is they are taking DNA samples from people who currently live in different geographic locations. They analyze these to find unique chromosome sequences, often called SNPs, SNP, which are similar. And the basic idea behind what's called a SNP is it is a sequence of DNA that doesn't change particularly frequently. So if you and I share like 6 SNPs in a row on chromosome 10, okay, that's probably not random. Those are probably the same, okay? And then they've isolated the ones that change at about once every generation. And that's the ones they really follow. So if you say this changes once every generation, and there's a sequence of 10 of them in a row, and we match on all 10, and then that's really not likely to be random. So that's how you begin to determine similarities. These unique sequences are then used to find whether someone who took a DNA test has ancestry from these geographic locations. So if we go back here, what they're doing is basically saying, we've taken a large sample of people who currently live in Norway, or currently live in Iceland, or currently live in Newfoundland, or whatever, Ireland. And based on that, we can say, you've got a lot in common with those people. And the more people they look at, the better they're able to say, yeah, you've got a lot in common with these people, okay, statistically. And at this point, a firm like Ancestry has many millions of DNA tests. Now, generally speaking, ethnicity can be divided in a couple of different categories, and I've deliberately set up these 3. One is what we're looking at a moment ago, genetic descent. The second one is common geographic origin, which is not necessarily the same thing. Okay, if I were to take a fairly simple example, if I said you were from Northern Ireland, okay, you're going to have a whole bunch of mixes of genetics that relate to you, but you're from a specific place. And a lot of, not my McKinneys, but a lot of McKinneys turn out to be in Northern Ireland. The third is common culture. Language, religion, cuisine, customs, go down the list. Ways of dancing, etc. So when we talk about ethnicity, we don't mean the same thing all the time. So my first example, just to have fun with it, is this. If you've ever been to New Zealand, you know that the Maori, which are the native New Zealanders, are known for their aggressiveness. And this becomes the heart of the rugby mentality for New Zealand. And in fact, Polynesia, which is the whole combination of New Zealand over to Easter Island, Pitcairn Island, up to Hawaii, including Samoa, okay, all of these people have a common genetic background. And if you study it as the, people who studied the male genealogy, they can trace the sequence as people came from across the Pacific, came into the French Polynesia area, and then from there went to Hawaii and Easter Island. I had to include this. If you're unfamiliar with this, this is a ocean map for the Polynesians. All right, and what it means, I just love it. What it is it's the currents. They would follow the currents to get to the different islands. So I just thought that's fun. So what else do we know? We know their language is similar. Woman in Hawaiian is Wahine. In the Marquesas, it's Vahine. In Tahiti, it's Vahine. Okay, the Maori is Wahine. The language is very similar. So, Polynesia, common genetics, common geography, although over a large area, and very common culture. The second one we're going to look at, getting back to Elihu's discussion earlier, is the world of the shtetl, or the Ashkenazi Jews. In the history of the Jewish diasporas, we had the Ashkenazi Jews who were driven out of Central Europe into Eastern Europe. We have the Sephardic who were driven out of Spain. And then there's some Middle Eastern Jews who I don't know much about. So, common genetics. 40% of all the Ashkenazi Jews descend from one of 5 women. Common geography, all over Eastern Europe, but widely spread. And generally common culture. Similar language, customs, food, religion. Before I go on, Elihu, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to add any thoughts. We'll come back to this later, but if you can add any thoughts at the moment.
I'll just say that the Ashkenazi Jews, if you go a little further back in terms of relatedness in DNA, are also linked to the Sephardi Jews, the Mizrahi Jews, which was Iran, Syria, etc. And also there are, among all those groups, certain links in paternal subgroups, priests or Kohanim for one, which are quite closely genetically linked, but that's a different DNA marker, the paternal one. But that's all I'll say now, and we can go into that later if appropriate.
Okay, so I sent you all a link to MyHeritage because I found this to be extremely helpful for me to think about genetics and ethnicity. So this is the area that MyHeritage defines as the area for the Ashkenazi Jewish ethnicity. So pretty much universally Eastern Europe. And the second thing you can do with the MyHeritage site is look at what portion of the MyHeritage users by country have that ethnicity. And so, as you would expect, a large proportion of Israelis that have tested. Now, let's be clear here. These are the people in Israel who have tested DNA with MyHeritage. So it would be unlikely this would be a large population of the Palestinians, but it would be a large population of people who are interested in DNA and genealogy. Hungary, Argentina, Russia, South Africa. Okay, so I'm going to go to a different screen and see if I can. There we go. Okay, so how did I get here? This is the screen I sent everybody. And so I can start by basically saying, I want to look at a country. So let's take a look at, for example, Poland. So what happens is that these are the proportion of people in Poland who show these ethnicities. So starting here, does everybody sort of see the idea that it's hard to zero in on what we think of as being ethnically Polish based on the geography that is today Poland? It consists of this tremendous diversity. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense at the moment. We can go back, for example, and we can, I think the Middle East includes Israel. Yeah, there's Israel. Okay, so this is the breakout for Israel. Now, these numbers add to more than 100% because people have more than one genetic population. But the largest group are the Ashkenazi, and the next second largest are the Sephardic. Okay. All right, now I want to go back to the other screen. So here's another area that we could think of as being ethnic, and that would be, are you Irish? And if you think of Irish, one of the things you might think of is dancers, and these are Irish step dancers. And when we think of Ireland, we think of a common geography. We know where it is. We can put our hands around it. Pretty common culture, similar language and customs and food and religion. But it turns out genetically, the Irish are intermixed with the Scotch, the Welsh, and the Bretons. So therefore, a Scottish sword dancer is in fact genetically related to the Irish step dancers. And when we look at what is meant by the area of common genetic heritage, it goes from Scotland to Northern Ireland to Wales, down to Britain. Okay, so in this sense, if you say, I'm going to go do a DNA test because I want to prove I'm Irish, your DNA test is going to prove that you're from somewhere in the western part of the United Kingdom or from Brittany, which is fine. That's what it shows. I was always very confused because I would get a higher proportion of Irish in me than I am. So where are the people who have that ethnicity? The biggest chunk are in Ireland. The next biggest are in Great Britain, but they would be because Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are part of Great Britain. Then Australia, Canada, and I have no idea why Iceland. Isn't that fun? Now, again, going back, you can go online and do this kind of research. It's been particularly done for England. They have looked at DNA and tried to relate it to the invaders. So what they have concluded, and I cannot defend this, I'm just saying this is the way they concluded it, is the Saxons tended to be Eastern England. The Picts tend to be up in Scotland. The Scotch-Irish cut across this area. My sister is a historian, and she has constantly bombarded me with the fact that Northern Ireland and Scotland, people have gone back and forth between those two areas for centuries. And then we have the western side of Britain, which includes the Bretons. Okay, so ethnicity is a complex topic. That's not where I wanted to be. Excuse me a minute. Don't know why I jumped to the end there. So those of us who have some Polish would recognize some of this. This is my wife's map of genealogy. Now, her background is her father was French Canadian to the core, and her mother was the daughter of two immigrant, one from Poland and one from Lithuania, but they were both Polish. Okay, and so what do we get here? We get France, some English, the Baltics, some reason and Eastern Europe. So we can see this mix makes some sense based on what we know of her heritage. And now I'm going to focus down on the area that is defined as the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland here. And within that, you can see this little area in the middle that is the area defined as Mazovia and Lodz. And again, this is a genetic map. People in this area have very common genetic code. And here is the closer map of that area, which includes Lamza, which is the little area around where my wife's grandmother grew up. We've been back and actually visited the village there. And I mentioned this before, what Ancestry will do is it creates maps of where immigration occurred. So what they're saying is there's a lot of immigration from Poland, Lithuania, and the Polish-Czech grouping that went to, would you believe, Chicago? Would you believe New York? And other communities through the industrial part of the country. Marilyn, do you want to add anything at this point, or do you want to wait till the end and then throw your thoughts in?
I can do whatever you want. I've got my screen ready to go.
Okay, why don't I stop sharing and let you talk about yours a minute. Before we do that, well, I've got everybody on screen. Everybody following what's going on and generally understand what we're trying to do here. Okay, Marilyn, you're on.
Okay. Disabled screen sharing for me. You need to enable me.
Oh yeah, thank you. You're on.
Okay, I'm gonna share my desktop here. So when I started doing this and George wanted me to share, okay. When I first started doing this, and what George had talked about once before, is that the more people who do this, your numbers could change. So when I first started doing this on Ancestry, my ethnicity estimate came back as 99% Eastern European and Russia. And that was before they were doing more of these breakdowns. So now over time, it has changed. So now you see that I'm 86%. This big area in here, so Poland is right around in here, what we know is modern day Poland, but at one time, Poland was huge. All of this in the yellow that you're seeing is mostly Russia today. So I can break down into the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Lithuania, just as George did for Marie. And you'll see now a much smaller area. It's great because it gives you a little history of what's going on. But now over time, Ancestry keeps breaking down. So now for me in my area, it's considered Lesser Poland. And some of you might be familiar maybe with Krakow, and Warsaw is over here more to the right. So I can see these towns. My maiden name is Raza, R-Z-A-S-A, and you can see this town here has an R-Z. That's my father's side of the family. And so that RZ combination shows up here. And Poland was partitioned. So what we're looking at here is the Austrian partition, which is Galicia. And I can break down one more time to Malopolska and the Tatras. Gets me much narrower down. Here's Krakow again. And then I can expand on this. And as I'm expanding out, I was always told that our family was from the area of Auschwitz, which many of you know better by the German name of Auschwitz. And when hang on, I gotta zoom in here. A lot of great Polish names here. Let me go back in to Krakow. And come back out again. You get a lot more detail. You can just keep going and expanding out, and eventually you will get, and I found my little town of Grozek, which is on the birth certificate for my grandfather. So I won't belabor going through all this, but the more that you spread out, the more of these towns that you can see. And as George just showed you, there's a timeline of what's going on. And if I click right here into this 1900s timeline, this timeline between 1900 and 1925, this is when my grandparents, all four of them, came over. And again, as George showed, Chicago, and that's where my people settled, and that's where I'm from. So what had changed a little bit, and you can see up here my two grandfathers because they're in my family tree, is that, and maybe George could talk about this in a little bit more detail, what did change is that my ethnic breakdown, if you go back up farther, it starts to show again the Baltics, the Germanic, and Sweden. And the Swedes did invade Poland in the 1600s, so that's where we probably get some of that Swedish from. So George, you can go back to your screen and take me off of, I can stop sharing.
Okay. So again, everybody's sort of following what's going on. Are we all, any questions at this point before I continue? I'm looking at Alan's background over there. No comments. Okay, so we're going to go back. And okay, so another popular place to think about, shall we call this Germany for the purpose of discussion? So this is the proportion of MyHeritage DNA users in Germany who have different ethnicities. And talk about a grab bag of stuff, okay? You may want to say that you're German, but you're not going to figure that out from a DNA analysis, okay? It is way too complicated. Take a look at this group. There's something they call North and West European, East Europe, that's this area, East European, Scandinavian, Balkan, and English, okay? All mixed together. So while German may bring to mind certain cultural aspects and culinary aspects, they're not going to match with the genetics. All right, so if we want to continue, this is a hypothetical English breakfast. We all have a good sense of the Queen's Guard. England has somewhat a similar situation. And that's because of the invasions. That we have the English portion, we have the Irish Welsh portion, we have the Scandinavian portion, the Northwestern European, and Iberian. There are those who say that the Iberian has to do with the Armada and the Spanish sailors who stayed behind and left their DNA there. Heaven knows. For those who may have had the opportunity, this is the Palio in Siena. And we can think about food in Italy. Now we all of a sudden get into a different problem when we think about ethnicity. The two dishes we're looking at here represent different cultures within Italy. You are not going to find the same food anywhere near in Sicily that you will in Milan. They're just different. Okay. And when you start looking at the different ethnicities for Italy, okay, you've still got this North and Western European, which is going to affect part of Italy, but you've now also got a whole Greek and Southern Italian group that's affecting Sicily and the Boot, okay, and an Iberian group that also is going to affect Italy, okay. For those who have ever been to Sicily, the Spanish were there, the Normans were there. Everybody ran Sicily at one time or another. And then a North African group. This is the other way of looking at it, which is to say, if you look at people who have Italian ethnicity, where are they? Italy, Malta and Cyprus, Argentina and Brazil. And this is French Canada. And we don't have an actual direct link from French Canada back to Europe, but it has been studied. They have looked at the ethnicities, and of course, these are the original area for what was Quebec. These are the Native Americans. And of course, we have to leave with some Swedish here. This is the Swedish festival over in the East Bay someplace, I don't remember where. And there is no such thing ethnically as Swedish per se. There's a Scandinavian grouping, okay, Finnish, once again, Baltic, okay. And this makes some sense. I mean, a certain amount of this is just people making their way around the sea here. This I found just expanding on the basics, everybody shows up with Scandinavian DNA. Okay. Now, what I wanted to do when I went into this was to recognize that ethnicity based on DNA is not the same as ethnicity based on geography or culture. So you don't do DNA in order to prove that you're Irish or to prove that you're Swedish or to prove. What you're doing there is you are looking at a broader ethnic mix, typically. If it's culture or geography you're interested in, that's going to be conventional genealogy, okay? And if I go back for a moment to the Swedish communities existed throughout America, and they were fairly homogeneous, and they brought the culture with them, but the genetics are much more complicated. Okay, that was what I sort of wanted to talk about today, and I will open it up to other people sharing their experiences and their thoughts about their own ethnicity. No volunteers? Okay, Robert, you're on.
We take it off.
You're off.
One of the things that we kind of forget, if Queen Victoria in 1830 married a German guy, also the current queen married a German ancestry thing. So there's a real tie-in, and they're both from Scotland. There's a real tie-in between Scottish and England and Germany, and nobody really totally understands that at all. But these are real things that happen. So
yeah, I mean, if you go back to any conventional genealogical research you may have done, Okay,
Yeah.
I have a line that is Huguenot.
Yeah.
And the Huguenots went from France to the Netherlands to
Right.
England and then to Virginia.
Right.
And my group ended up in Virginia because they thought they were headed to New England and the ship got blown off course.
Yeah.
So they ended up in Virginia. When they landed, the governor of Virginia basically said, "Hi, you're all going to now be indentured for 7 years." Okay. True story. So that's how my Huguenots got to Virginia. But as you said, Robert, they went through each of these places, and of course, as they go through, they're leaving behind a genetic signature.
Yeah.
Okay. They continue to confuse things to beat the band. Further comments, thoughts? Eliu. You got you. You're on
One first thing I wanted to mention is that it's important for us to remember that when we name a country now, it's completely different than what it was in the 17th century, the 16th century, the 18th century. Even saying Germany doesn't make sense in the 16th and 17th century. And it certainly doesn't make sense when you say Sweden, because Sweden and Norway and Denmark were back and forth in terms of what it is now as compared to what it was then. And it's important for us to see that difference. Also, what Robert mentioned about the royal families is very different than what it is for common folks. The royalty in Europe is has a whole different genetic markers and connections, and it really is not connect. I mean, for instance, Prince Philip was the Prince of Greece. I mean, it's a very strange, but he has no Greekness in him except in terms of the royalty. So it's very different markers for royalty and the royal families than for the rest of the ethnic groups. I think it's important for us to recognize that, even though we use the same word, Poland in the 20th century and the 19th century is very different than Poland in the 16th and 17th century, when it included Lithuania and most of Eastern Russia, most of Western Russia, and much of what we think of as Austria, Czechoslovakia, et cetera, et cetera.
One of the other points, just following up on that, is that because of the diaspora, we have a very sharp knowledge of what happened with the Jewish population in Europe. And they were encouraged to leave, let us say, Central Europe and go to Eastern Europe. But that also happened to other populations. You know, the western part of what is today Poland has been a place where people have been shoved aside constantly. Germany would take it over, and it would move out the people who were of Polish descent who happened to occupy that area, and they'd move in Germans. Okay, the same thing would be true for Belarus and Ukraine, where once again, when Russia took over, it would move people out. And I mean, Stalin was well known for this. Large populations were moved. So the idea that the population that's there today, where all of a sudden MyHeritage goes in and it does the DNA sample of people who live in the western part of what is today Poland, okay, those aren't going to be the same people who live there genetically, particularly live there 50 or 100 years ago necessarily. Okay, other thoughts? So, I've got you unmuted.
Oh, okay, thank you. I've been following MyHeritage in terms of those characteristics that are typical of Ashkenazi Jews. And it turns out that as a group, there's a whole set of diseases that are more likely to occur in that particular group. And my own family has experienced that, in that I have Parkinson's disease, which is one of the diseases that is in that list of those that are related to Ashkenazi Jews. And both of my daughters do as well. which is kind of unusual in the scientific sense, but in the genealogical sense, it isn't at all. So it's been very interesting to me to wonder why it might be that this particular group has an overwhelming number of these diseases. People joke that all the Ashkenazi Jews came from 3 ancestors or something like that. But my guess is that because they often lived in the shtetls and didn't interact with other groups, that there was a lot of intermarriage among those people. But that's just the area that I'm interested in.
Yeah, you can see that in other cultures as well. I mean, if I look at my own family coming out of the Appalachians, there were isolated communities there that only intermarried. Okay, I've got several cases in my family where I can point to first cousins and second cousins marrying. Okay, which really screws up the analysis when you want to sit down and do genealogical research by DNA. Okay, what do you do when you have, I mean, I literally have one case where I have a person who is my second great grandfather twice and my third great grandfather once by 3 different lines. Okay, and the DNA calculation on that is just crazy. Elihu, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just want to say in terms of Ashkenazi Jews, there's some places where that you could trace it to approximately 300 individuals. And there's a lot of inbreeding because, well, for obvious reasons, if you have such a small group, people would marry cousins was fairly common. And because of that, you're going to have the development of certain genetic and disease markers, which are going to be more common in those groups. You can see the difference between, let's say, Ashkenazi Jews and let's say Sephardic Jews, because there aren't those common disease markers between them, or Mizrahi Jews, which are Jews from Syria, Iraq, Iran, Israel. So it's different disease markers, but it's because the Ashkenazi Jews were inbred, and that's it.
Okay. I'm sure that everybody is roughly aware of this, but the DNA site 23andMe is the one that focuses on genetic inherited conditions. So if you do your DNA with them, one of the things that they can do is look at a series of markers that have been studied that identify questions like Parkinson's, and will say there are these markers. Now, when they find a marker, it usually, in some rare cases it does, but it usually doesn't mean that you are guaranteed to have that condition. All right, it just means a very large fraction of the people who have that condition show with that genetic marker. Elio, you wanted to add?
There are tests that Ashkenazi Jews are encouraged to do before they marry, because genetic tests in terms of if both partners have certain markers, then they have to have cautions about what sort of tests to do with their children, or what sort of diseases that children might be more likely to have, and what sort of precautions you could do in vitro or soon after the child is born. I know it's done regularly now if you come from those ethnic groups.
Okay. Other thoughts on ethnic background? Okay. Anybody want to add? Okay, Sally.
information. This is a question. When I had mine done, my DNA done in 2 Ancestry and 23andMe, at that time, I think gender was the, that they stayed consistent with if you're female, you get just the mother's side and so forth. I'm not up to date on whether they're now showing both.
Okay, real quickly for those who need the primer. DNA testing involves 3 different kinds of DNA. Okay, as you know, when a man is conceived, he has Y DNA. A woman, he has an XY chromosome. The woman has an XX chromosome. So if you're a man, they will study your Y chromosome and all of the people who relate to you who have similar Y chromosomes, which will be men.
Yeah. Right.
If you're a woman, okay, you carry a mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, that is unique to you. It is not part of the normal DNA. It sits inside your cell. It's unique to your mother. So a man can study his mother's mitochondrial DNA, okay, as a woman can. But from there up, it all comes from the mother. So mine came from my mother, but hers came from her mother, which came from her mother, which came from her mother.
Right.
Okay. And so because of that, they can trace women a straight line, all the maternal line. They can trace that back centuries. And indeed, that's the method by which, Sue, they came up with the idea that there are these 5 women who actually represent 40% of all Ashkenazi Jews can trace their mitochondrial DNA to one of these 5 women. Okay, which is weird, but that's the way it is. Okay, and of course that may make some sense because of the Jewish religion giving such a priority to your maternal line. That helps to define you. Okay, the third is what's called autosomal DNA. And that's just all the rest of your DNA, 23 chromosomes. So Sally, if you did the test back then, you would probably have done a mitochondrial test. Okay, you'd want to do a new test that's autosomal.
Yeah, that was in the early 2000s.
Yeah, the autosomal is much more complicated, but as they've had the opportunity to look at very large populations, they're able now to get a much finer review of the autosomal, and it really can be quite accurate. I think most of you who've been around me know my published paper on this is I actually found one of my ancestors, my great-great-grandfather, did not have the parents that we thought he had. Okay, and when we studied it further, I was able to identify an unexpected paternal link, meaning somebody that nobody knew about who was his father. Okay, and his mother was the daughter of the couple that had been shown for all decades as his parents. So what had happened was, instead of being the last child born of his grandmother, he was a child born of one of the teenage girls in that family. Mm-hmm. And by following the autosomal DNA, there were three women who would have been of childbearing age in that family. And I was able to identify which one of the 3 it was.
Wow.
So it's really amazingly accurate now.
Thank you.
Okay, any other inputs? Alan.
Hi, just want to let you know it's good to be here. I've attended a few of the sessions at Oakmont, and Claire Miller actually steered me onto the group. We're good friends with her and Russ. Anyway, I like to say, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe 6 or 8 years ago, spit in the bottle, paid $90 to learn that I was 99+% Ashkenazi Jewish. Of course, I knew that. But one of the issues that as an Ashkenazi Jew I have using DNA, of course, it's like the Appalachian population or any of the populations that do a lot of in marriage, within cousins because of the small shtetls. You've got something called endogamy, where you've got lots of little snippets of DNA that all add up, and you've got gazillions of cousins, and often the predictions of how close you are way off, that it shows you to be much closer cousins than you actually are. And I just looked here on my ancestry. I have, if I look at all matches as of today, 176,303 relatives. So I don't think I'd be able to use all of that to try to find my family tree.
Let me share a screen though with you, Alan, because there's something we talked about, I think, at our last meeting. I don't know if you were at it, that might be relevant. Let's see, I got to get the right slide here. Yeah, this is the one. Okay. I want to go back to Ancestry DNA, and this is the DNA match area. And over here is what they call through lines.
Right, yeah.
Okay, and that's what I find to be fairly valuable, because what that does is it begins to look at earlier generations. And let me go back a couple here. So I'm going to look at Amanda Vaughn. And I should probably go to let me take another one. Let me take James Madison Martin. Okay, these are the people who I match with on James Madison Martin. And so what this is all of his known children. And I match a child of Louise's, a child of John, two child of John's, one of the Doziers, actually probably more than that, two of Linville's kids. So one of the things I look for is this. If you go across, okay, how many of the children am I actually related to? You with me?
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
This is how you begin to verify that your paper genealogy and your DNA genealogy match up. The second part of what you look at is how the closeness, which is the centimorgan, the 45 centimorgans right. here, how that matches with the degree of closeness. So if I've got someone who's a second cousin once removed, does that 45 look like the right kind of number? Mm-hmm. The answer is it does. But you can do a lot of that as well. And sometimes what you find is there's an error. And this is a good place to be looking. And I think particularly in your case, the numbers will be different. The actual number for the closeness will be different mm-hmm. than mine are for the same level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have looked at that.
Okay.
It also, in order for that to work, means you have to have the tree, and other people have to have trees there to make that kind of try to line things up.
But one of the things you can do is if you have a hypothesis, mm-hmm. okay, you can actually put the hypothetical person in your tree on Ancestry.
Okay.
Okay, and then give it a week or two so they go through their calculations.
Huh. Okay.
Start looking at, well, if that were correct, how does that look? Mm-hmm. Does it begin to look like that match is for real?
Okay, I haven't tried that, so interesting.
That's another technique.
Right.
Okay.
There's also a chart that I downloaded where it looked at statistical data. It was basically puts yourself and then your siblings and your first cousins and second cousins and remove, yeah. And then it gives you a range of centimorgans to a 99% percentile of what DNA matches could be for relatives. Now that doesn't take into account endogamy, but for the general population, it's apparently pretty good.
Yeah, and one of the ways that's done is people have collected large amounts of data,
right?
Which this matches against. Ellie, you wanted to make an addition there.
Yes, I just wanted to say that sometimes you could also look at my heritage and see what other family trees are, what should I say, overlapping with yours. Because if you start putting up yours, you might find that there are other family trees around on my heritage that you could link up with it, depending upon circumstances. And you'd be surprised at what you might discover.
Okay. So Roger, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I have not had a DNA test. I went into MyHeritage and went to America, then USA, than Minnesota, where I'm from. But I couldn't see any reference there to Native Americans. Does my heritage follow Native Americans, or are they left out of the equation?
Native Americans are followed, but one of the problems is that there is no neat subcategory beyond Native American. So the number of Native Americans who've been tested is not large.
So that's the problem, huh? Okay.
And within that, with some very unusual exceptions, you can't look at tribal connections, which is what I'd love to do, because I know the person. I can point to my Indian ancestor, okay, but I can't guarantee you I know which tribe he was from.
Right, okay. All right, thanks.
Okay, well, that'll be it for this week. In a month, we'll have another session, and we're going to focus on thinking like a historian. And the biggest element of that's going to be the discussion about critical thinking when you look at genealogical records. But I must say, it's encouraging to me to see that they're actually trying to teach critical thinking in high school. That's a real positive element in our lives. Thank you all. See you next month.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.